Ground News is combating divisiveness in media. Ground is a news comparison platform that helps you see multiple perspectives for any news story so you can be more of a well-rounded news reader. Download the free app at ground.news/Pakman. All right, let's jump right in today. Many topics related to the pandemic that we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about an anti-vaccine hearing. We will be talking about lab leak. But first, let's just kind of reset where we are. Coronavirus cases in the United States are now down more than 94%. We are now at the point where we are asking, with so many people refusing to get vaccinated, how much lower are cases going to go? Because this thing is going to keep floating around. Are we getting to about as low a point in daily cases as we're going to get anytime soon because the virus is going to keep floating around among unvaccinated populations? I think the answer is not quite yet. I think we'll still see a decline, but we'll know within 2 to 3 weeks. But we are down more than 94% from the case peak in roughly mid-January. Now, in terms of U.S. coronavirus deaths, we are now down more than 88% in daily deaths. Still 400 people a day are dying in the United States of coronavirus. It's still a horrible number. But when we talk about getting back to baseline risk, I believe it's around 300 people a day over a year that during the average flu season die in the United States. So we're getting very close to that baseline level of risk that we see equivalent to the flu. 400 is still high, but it is the lowest it's been during the entire pandemic. You've got to go back to March of 2020 to find death numbers this low in the United States. Now, there are many people saying, and a few emailed me, David, is this actually because of the vaccines or is this just because of the seasonality? Because if you look at cases and deaths last summer, they were just as low. And that's not at all true. So the first question is, are the premises right? And they are not. We are now at 14,000 cases per day and declining. The lowest point last summer was 22,000 cases per day, and they went all the way up to 70,000 cases per day. So it's not even close. It's not true that cases were this low last summer. Now, looking globally, cases are now down about 50%. Last week, we were down 40% from the global peak. Now we're down 50% from the global peak. Remember that the global peak was about 830,000 cases per day, an insane number. So this is already major progress, although there's still a long way to go, and many parts of the world are completely or almost completely unvaccinated. And then globally, deaths, which, as we now know, lag cases by several weeks. Global deaths are down about 34% from their peak. We still have nearly 10,000 people a day dying of COVID globally. Much of that is the unvaccinated population, but we are down from more than 14,000 deaths a day. So everything's moving in the right direction, never as quickly as we would like, but fortunately, vaccinations in the United States are starting to tick back up again after months-long decline. So we started seeing this in mid-April. Daily vaccinations peaked at roughly 3.3 million a day. That was a very good number. We were hoping to get to 3.5 or even 4 million a day. But then vaccinations started to decline and decline and decline, all the way down to under 1 million vaccinations per day. Over the last week, we were down. Last week, we had a 1-week average of 930 vaccinations per day in a country of 331 million people. It's terrible. It's pathetic. It's horrifying. And we'll talk about the anti-vax stuff in a bit. We are now starting to see a slight uptick once again, back up to about 1.1 million vaccine doses per day. So there will hopefully now be the more reluctant people who will start to realize maybe my school is going to require the vaccine. Maybe my employer is going to require the vaccine. Maybe the vaccine will be required to go on a trip to the country that I want to go and visit. Maybe you need a vaccine to sit in the vaccinated full capacity section of your local sports stadium, and maybe that will encourage people to go and get themselves vaccinated. Whatever the case, 1 million vaccine doses a day just isn't good when we still have so many tens of millions upon tens of millions of people who could go and get a vaccine. These are widely available. There are countries desperate to get vaccines. We have so many, And yet 1/5 of the population by last count just isn't interested. Now, one thing that does seem like it will convince people, maybe, will be full FDA approval of the vaccines. The unvaccinated population, 1/3 of that population says, I will be going to get a vaccine once the FDA fully approves the vaccines. Remember, right now, they're approved under an emergency use authorization, not full approval. So I would love to believe that as soon as that approval comes, 1/3 of the vaccine hesitant folks will go and get vaccinated. I can't say I'm convinced. I think it's something that many of them are saying right now. And then once that full approval comes down, they're going to come up with something else. Now, I also just disagree with the premise of saying I'm going to wait for the full approval before going and getting vaccinated. Catching COVID in the meantime, while you wait for that full approval, is likely statistically to be way worse than the side effects you might have from the vaccine before it's fully approved. And remember, once it's fully approved, and it will be, the side effects aren't going to change. The efficacy is not going to change. But with the approval coming, it would be great to take any of that anti-vax group, vaccine hesitant group, off the table and get them vaccinated. If they're genuinely waiting for full approval and they're really going to go and get vaccinated at that time, great. I look forward to them doing that. Now, let's talk about one statistic in the US that is pandemic related that is really not looking very good. And that is that hospitalizations in the United States are rising, not overall, but in areas with low vaccination rates. Now, we've been talking for months at this point in time. If 20% of the country never gets vaccinated, which the latest polling we have is that 20% of the country does not plan to get the coronavirus vaccine, what's going to happen? Well, we'll never eradicate it fully. We may never anyway, but in addition to not eradicating it fully, you're going to see these clusters pop up in the areas that have a lower percentage of the population vaccinated. And statistically speaking, most of the people who get it will be the unvaccinated. But the vaccines aren't 100% effective. When we say 94, 95%, that means roughly 1 out of 20 people who get vaccinated do not develop antibodies. So these unvaccinated areas will also lead to some vaccinated people getting sick. And statistically, if enough of them get sick, some of those people are going to die. This is happening now. We had the idea maybe that would be at the end of summer, maybe into the fall or winter, where you would start to see these clusters. They're happening now. There's a new New York Times report which says, in the US, hospitalizations are rising in areas with low vaccination rates. Health officials worry that COVID-19 hospitalization rates could increase among the unvaccinated as variants of the virus spread. The coronavirus might be receding in much of the US, this article writes, but it continues to spread in communities with low COVID vaccination rates where highly contagious virus variants pose a threat to those who have not had shots. As an example, the article mentions Smith County, Tennessee. Only 20% of the population in Smith County, Tennessee are fully vaccinated. And there has been a 700% increase in hospitalizations for COVID-19 over the last 2 weeks, according to the New York Times database. Another example, in Truesdale, Tennessee, or maybe it's pronounced Trousdale, 23% of the population is fully vaccinated. Hospitalizations up 700%. This is not a coincidence. Dr. Ted Delbridge says, in most age groups, people who become ill are twice as likely to end up hospitalized as people who got the virus earlier in the pandemic. What does this mean? This means that these variants are not only more contagious, but more likely to make you sick if you are not vaccinated. So all else being equal, if you have 50% of the population unvaccinated now versus at some previous point, now more likely people are going to get really sick and sick enough to get hospitalized because of these variants. In Maryland, of those between 50 and 59 years of age who got COVID over the winter, 8% were hospitalized. From April on, 19% of people in that age group who got the virus were hospitalized. And the vaccines protect you. This is not going to stop. This is not going to go away in this way. And I know that there's a lot of tough talk about, I'm healthy, I eat a good diet, I exercise, etc. That doesn't protect you from COVID-19. And as the variants that are predominant are more transmissible and or more likely to put you in the hospital, you are taking a real big risk by being unvaccinated, but you are also putting other people at risk. At this point, it's like a broken record. I don't know how many times it has to be said. The vaccines are effective against the variants. They are slightly less effective against some of the most recent variants, but you get really good protection from all known variants so far if you just go and get vaccinated. And so we talked earlier about the numbers. We're now down to about 14,000 cases per day. It's really quite low, some of the lowest we've been at for a while. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here if we continue to see this vaccine hesitancy? So a little bit later, we're going to talk about Biden's infrastructure negotiations and some other things. Later, we're going to actually have video from a hearing where attendees were arguing against any kind of required vaccination. And the nuttery is growing significantly. The nuttery is spreading like a virus. So we're going to talk about that later. We're going to talk about lab leak. But send me your thoughts. How low do you think cases can go if 20% of the population really refuses to get themselves vaccinated? Let me know. You can find me on Twitter at @Pakman. I've been on Fox News a couple of times. If I'm ever invited back, ground news is one of the first things I would use to get my head in the game and prepare myself for the interview, because ground news is a news source comparison platform that lets you compare how outlets from the left, right, and center are reporting on a story. It makes it easy to see the nuances of how sources with differing political biases are covering a story. And it also shows you your news blind spots, stories that your side of the political spectrum may not have covered. Ground news can help you build a well-crafted argument for debating people you disagree with, or ground news can help you discover something new about your own perspective, challenging your own strongly held views on political issues. Be the most informed person in the room. Download the free Ground News app today by going to ground.news/Pakman. Remember that our program is mostly funded by memberships from folks like you who sign up at joinpakman.com. You get lots of great member benefits, including daily access to the members-only bonus show in audio and video formats, as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show. It's all happening at joinpakman.com. You can use the coupon code BETTER21 to get a membership with a discount. So Joe Biden is ending negotiations with Republicans over the infrastructure bill. And this now puts the possibility of budget reconciliation in focus. Joe Biden got off to a relatively fast start, immediately signing a bunch of executive orders on doing some of the nonsense that Donald Trump did. Getting the $1.9 trillion COVID stimulus passed, not as quickly as we would have liked, but still, by Washington terms, relatively quickly. And then rolling out a very successful vaccination program. But what is next? And we've been talking about, if it's not going to be infrastructure, it's got to be something else that's big. But infrastructure really seems like the way to go. Joe Biden has been negotiating with Senator Shelley Moore Capito and some other Republicans over infrastructure legislation, and CBS News now reports that it's over. Joe Biden has said to Senator Capito that the last Republican proposal doesn't meet the essential needs of our country to fix roads and bridges. It doesn't prepare the country for a future that will be reliant on clean energy, and it doesn't create jobs. And this is according to the White House press secretary. And so what is now next? And the answer is, I don't know. When you look at the details that have been released of this negotiation that Joe Biden had with House and Senate lawmakers, he reduced his plan by over $1 trillion. That's a big concession from Joe Biden already. And then Republicans came up in new investments by only $150 billion. And this is the prototypical situation where you negotiate and you negotiate and you negotiate with Republicans. You settle on something in the middle, and then they don't vote for it anyway. So what was all of the negotiation for? Now, I am not against Joe Biden doing some discussion. I think it's fine that he did that, because now he can say, We gave major concessions. We sliced $1 trillion off of this thing, and then they wanted to give us essentially nothing, and so we're moving on without them. I don't think that that's a waste of time. What will become a waste of time is now if they don't simply make this happen via budget reconciliation. Can they actually do that? I don't know. I don't know that Joe Manchin actually wants the bill the way that it is. And by the way, I mean, from an infrastructure perspective, West Virginia is a disaster. And by infrastructure, I mean traditional infrastructure, like bridges and tunnels and roads and this type of thing. But broadband infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure, educational infrastructure, and on and on. If there is anybody in the Senate who should be desperate for the biggest possible infrastructure package, it actually should be Joe Manchin. But as we talked about yesterday, I wasn't kidding when I said Joe Manchin was going to be a problem. And it's not even clear to me that Democrats have the 50 votes in order to pass this via budget reconciliation. If we step back for a second, I've gotten emails from people saying, is this something that can be done via budget reconciliation? Sometimes you'll hear some on the left say, Joe Biden should just do Medicare for all through budget reconciliation. First of all, Joe Biden doesn't support Medicare for all, but putting that aside, my best reading of when budget reconciliation can be used would not allow it to be used for Medicare for all. That being said, there is no question that budget reconciliation can be used to pass Joe Biden's infrastructure bill with 50 votes in the Senate rather than the 60 you would normally need. But that's only if you have all 50 votes from Democratic senators, and it's not at this point clear that Joe Biden actually does. The New York Times also reporting on the stalled negotiations, not really stalled, ended negotiations, saying, after weeks of failed efforts to bridge deep divides, the president pulled the plug, turning to a bipartisan group to try to salvage a chance at compromise. My question is, how long do you keep going at it from this approach? Because you end up with what are sometimes these Pyrrhic victories where you do so much damage in the process of negotiating something that Republicans will accept that you are really compromising on your ability to pass something that's substantive. And with the current Republicans, as we saw with the COVID bill, sometimes you spend all this time negotiating and they all vote against it anyway. So my sense is that we're sort of getting to the end here. The New York Times writes sort of pseudo-optimistically, the breakdown did not close off the possibility of a bipartisan compromise entirely, and the White House signaled that the president would continue seeking one. He shifted his focus to a bipartisan group of centrist senators who have been working separately on an alternative, calling 3 of them personally to cheer on efforts and encourage them to work with top White House officials to hammer out a deal. But even if the group can agree on a plan palatable to Joe Biden, there's no guarantee enough Republicans would accept it. That is exactly the point that needs to be considered. How much longer are we doing this with Republicans who, it's conceivable that you get, I don't know, Joe Manchin and Mitt Romney in a room, and they come up with something that they say they would support. But then do you still have 60 votes? Or are you put in the position of having to go through budget reconciliation, and then you're just arguing with your own side? You're arguing with Joe Manchin. Joe, listen, we have 49. We need 50. What are you willing to do for us? And this is the exact, when you talk about the type of partisan gridlock that sometimes it's bipartisan gridlock. When you talk about the type of partisan gridlock where the American people just look at it and say, this is why I am disillusioned about even voting. This is why we have voter turnout of 55% at midterms. Because on the one hand, we understand that every 2 years we get to say we don't like the people representing us in the House of Representatives. Every 4 years you get to say that about the White House. Every 6 years you get to say that about your senator from your particular state. But then when you see this stuff where Democrats aren't even all on the same page, the things that Republicans and Democrats agree upon, they don't have support for from the broader party, or you end up in a situation where even those with the majority, in this case Democrats, a slim majority, 50-50 with Kamala's tie-breaking vote, are negotiating against themselves, and will Joe Manchin vote for it? Will Sinema vote for it? I get being disillusioned with the system. And this is sort of like the worst of the worst of the worst of American politics. I don't know whether this thing's going to pass. If you said, take a bet, I think 55-45, something passes. How much it will look like Joe Biden's initial proposal, I have absolutely no idea, but I'm interested in hearing from you. Do you think this will go anywhere? Remember when the Republican Party under Donald Trump completely abandoned even pretending to care about policy and instead became all about cultural issues and so-called defending speech and being for speech, free speech, more speech, and also when they were against business regulations? It was always complete and total nonsense, but it has now actually come to a head with former President Donald Trump actually cheering Nigeria, banning Twitter and Facebook, and Trump suggesting more countries should do it, and Trump alluding to the idea that he should have done it as president of the United States. Whether he could have actually done that remains an open question. This is absolutely stunning because it not only violates the principle of Republicans being about more speech, since these are speech platforms after all, it also violates the principle of Republicans being against business regulation because it is outlawing, if the US were to outlaw Twitter and Facebook, a legal business merely because Donald Trump doesn't like what he perceives to be the political leanings of their enforcement of terms of service. Donald Trump put out a statement in which he said, quote, "Congratulations to the country of Nigeria, who just banned Twitter because they banned their president. More countries should ban Twitter and Facebook for not allowing free and open speech. All voices should be heard. In the meantime, competitors will emerge and take hold. Who are they to dictate good and evil if they themselves are evil? Perhaps I should have done it while I was president, but Zuckerberg kept calling me and coming to the White House for dinner, telling me how great I was." 2024, Trump asks. So there's a lot to say here, but here is the most important point. Nigeria banning those platforms has nothing to do with Nigeria wanting Twitter and Facebook to just allow more speech the way Donald Trump suggests. Nigeria banned those platforms to limit this free speech of their citizens to complain about the Nigerian government. That's fundamentally what's at issue here. So either Trump doesn't get it or he gets it and he has the exact same goals, but either way, it's absolutely despicable. Now, as far as the right-wing position on this stuff, wasn't the perspective of Republicans about this type of thing that if enough people are upset with Twitter and Facebook for, as Trump calls it, not allowing free and open speech, wouldn't people then abandon the platforms and then wouldn't competitors arise and it will all be resolved by the free market, as they love to say? Of course, it turns out that, first of all, most people are okay with the enforcement of terms of service by these platforms. People have not abandoned the platforms in any significant capacity, and the alternatives have been terrible. We've seen Parler, Gab, I guess, is a thing. Mike Lindell's platform, Frank Speech, I don't even know if that was online for more than 30 minutes. And then, of course, are the facts about the platforms. Look at Facebook, for example. The top posts every day are almost all right-wing voices. Conservatives are absolutely crushing it on Facebook. If you look, what were the top posts today or this week? It's Ben Shapiro, right-winger. It's Dan Bongino, right-winger. It's Sean Hannity, right-winger. It's the Daily Caller post, Fox News post, and occasionally a Rachel Maddow post makes it into the top Facebook posts of the day or the week. The conservative talking heads dominate Facebook, and yet they claim to be endless victims. Now, one last thing on this. When Trump mentions how Mark Zuckerberg was coming to the White House and telling Trump how great he is, and that's related to why Trump didn't ban Facebook, although he should have, Trump is admitting he didn't try to ban Facebook at the time because Mark Zuckerberg was telling him what a great guy he is and what a great job he's doing. So Trump is admitting something which we already knew, which is Trump makes policy based on who praises him and who criticizes him and who is his friend and who likes him and who does Trump like. It's disgusting to hear Donald Trump admit it, but we suspected that that was the case all along. We're going to have more on this story on our Instagram. If you are not following the David Pakman Show on Instagram, follow us. Please follow at David Pakman Show. And if you want to see a really wild and wacky piece of hate mail I got this morning, check out my Instagram, david.pakman. We'll take a quick break. Some really wacky anti-vax nuttery coming up after this short break. Don't forget that the best way to support the David Pakman Show is by becoming a member, which gives you access to the daily bonus show, the regular show with no commercials. You also get access to our entire archive of every episode dating back a really long time and plenty of other awesome membership perks. Go to joinpakman.com and use the coupon code BETTER21 for a huge discount. Joinpakman.com. All right, so we're continuing to follow the truly malignant growth of the coronavirus anti-vaccine movement, and I have some really stunning video to show you today. This is real video of a hearing in Ohio about a bill which would ban any Ohio business or school from mandating COVID vaccination. This looks like a satirical show. When you watch it, it actually looks like an episode of Judge Judy or something, or a Saturday Night Live parody of Judge Judy, but it's sadly real. Here you are going to see Sherry Tenpenny, who goes by doctor. Now, she is an osteopathic physician. I don't want to get into a whole thing about MD versus DO. She is a DO. Let's not even really touch that right now because I will get a lot of hate and furious people. Let's simply say there are lots of reasonable DOs without question. There are also just tons and tons of nutty osteopathic doctors, including quack chiropractors and anti-vaccine nuts and all sorts of different stuff. We're just going to focus on Sherry Tenpenny here. Sherry Tenpenny spent much of this hearing saying, we really shouldn't live in fear of coronavirus. But then she shows up and spreads insane, irrational fears about vaccines. Take a look at this first video clip.
Thinking if you can think of any other product in any other industry that has killed more than 5,000 people stated in the VAERS database, and even if only half of those are true, 2,500 deaths in 6 months of use, and it's still full court press, full steam ahead. So it makes one have to wonder why. Why are we still doing this? Why are we putting people into nursing homes like that happened in New York and put people with known COVID into place?
So she first testified, stop living in fear of COVID. There's too much fear. People are too afraid. And then she says, you really should be afraid of that vaccine. That vaccine is actually something to really be afraid of. And then it truly went off the rails with Tenpenny claiming that there is metal in the vaccine which causes forks to stick to your forehead. She saw a video about that on the internet. And then she also just ties in some conspiracies about 5G cell phone networks. So let's hear from Dr. Sherry Tenpenny.
And some of the information that I think had been discussed on your podcast related to EMF frequencies.
That was a thought.
And
it was because right now we're all kind of hypothesizing. I mean, what is it that's actually being transmitted that's causing all of these things? Is it a combination of the protein, which now we're finding has a metal attached to it? I'm sure you've seen the pictures all over the internet of people who've had these shots and now they're magnetized. They can put a key on their forehead, it sticks. They can put spoons and forks all over them and they can stick. Because now we think that there's a metal piece to that. There's been people who've long suspected that there was some sort of an interface, yet to be defined, an interface between what's being injected in these shots and all of the 5G towers. Not proven yet, but we're trying to figure out what is it that's being transmitted to these unvaccinated people.
How insane is this stuff? This really should make us scared about the future of this country. It is shocking that this person was able to become a doctor of osteopathy. I have a hard time understanding how she even accomplishes simple things. Like, how does she go grocery shopping if her view of the world is this ridiculous? How did she drive a car to this hearing, quite frankly? Later on, one of the committee members asked Tenpenny, this hearing was in Ohio, remember, Dr. Tenpenny, how many people in Ohio where the hearing is being conducted have died from being vaccinated against COVID? Check out how that went.
For the record, if I've missed it here or there. Of the 5.5 million Ohioans who have gotten the COVID-19 shot through today over the last 6 months, how many do you believe have been killed by that shot?
Well, I guess I could just talk to you, right? So I don't know.
Okay, so she's not sure. She's not sure how many people died from the vaccine in Ohio. All right. Is it out of line to say that if she truly believes this stuff, she should be evaluated for delusions, psychosis, paranoid schizophrenia? Like, I'm not joking about mental illness. Is it out of line to ask that? How is she testifying as an expert on anything? Never mind vaccines. So what's happening here, to give you a little background on the bill, is that Republicans in Ohio, in the state General Assembly, want to weaken Ohio's vaccination laws for all vaccines, not just for COVID-19. So this was a hearing about House Bill 248. And the legislation would ban vaccine requirements on customers, employees, or students from businesses, hospitals, nursing homes, K-12 schools, colleges, daycares, or others. It would also prevent governments, insurers, or businesses from offering incentives for people to get vaccinated or even requesting that people get vaccinated. So it's an outrageous bill. And again, remember, they want to be about, we don't want regulation, except we're going to say businesses would be outlawed from even encouraging employees to go and get themselves vaccinated. It's absolutely bonkers. And the Ohio Capitol Journal points out that under the bill, if you are an asthmatic small business owner, for example, meaning you are at significantly higher risk of complications from COVID-19, you would have no legal right to require or even ask that your employees or customers that come in be vaccinated. You're a small business owner. Republicans are all about, hey, we're for business, we're against regulation, let these small business owners do what they want to do. They would prevent you, this law would prevent you from even saying, because of my status health-wise, I am requesting, not even necessarily mandating, I am requesting that my employees or my customers be vaccinated. So this is an absolute disaster that they are going in this direction. And look at the people who are testifying here. I mean, it is depressing that these are folks who are increasingly having an impact and having a say. And if you just listened, watch the videos. You see people sitting in the crowd sort of nodding as Dr. Tenpenny says these wacky things. It is depressing to see. Speaking of anti-vax, we actually have some, I think it's good news anyway. Remember that Wisconsin pharmacist who very early on tampered with 500 doses of the vaccine, making them unusable? He has now been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. This is good news. The only question is, should he have gotten more time in prison? And I'll talk about that in a moment. CBS 58 is reporting that Stephen Brandenburg, the ex-pharmacist, he is no longer a pharmacist, you will be glad to know, the ex-pharmacist convicted of intentionally tampering with more than 500 doses of the Moderna COVID vaccine, was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison on Tuesday. Brandenburg was a third-shift pharmacist at Advocate Aurora Health Hospital in Grafton, where he admits to intentionally removing dozens of vials of the Moderna coronavirus vaccine from refrigeration. 57 doses were administered to coworkers before hospital officials found out about this and destroyed the rest of the doses. The 57 doses were determined to be still effective and did not produce health effects for the patients who received them. At his sentencing, Brandenburg told the court he was greatly ashamed of his actions and he took responsibility for them. His defense attorney detailed how his life spiraled prior to the incident. He had a messy divorce. He had mental and emotional issues. He had a sense of disillusionment with work and with the stress of the pandemic. But his former employer was very angry and insisted he needs to be punished, that this has impacted hospital staff who are now just trying to rebuild confidence in the system there, that this won't happen again. Government prosecutors asked for 51 months, meaning 4 years, 3 months. The judge said that the guilty plea, the lack of criminal record, and other factors led to a 3-year sentence that the judge feels is just but not excessive. In addition to being imprisoned for 3 years, the judge ordered Brandenburg to serve 3 years of supervised release and to pay about $83,000 in restitution to the hospital. Now, this is just the federal case. There's also a state case related to this pending against Brandenburg. We will see what happens there. So first and foremost, 3 years. Is this enough time? Yeah, I mean, I guess so. What I think about is, if indeed, so a bunch of these doses, 57 of the 500 tampered doses were given to people, but then the rest of the 500 were thrown out. This was really early on in the pandemic. This was when there was really limited vaccine supply, and they were really only going to healthcare workers and those at the absolute highest risk. So delaying 450 doses, 443 doses, which was what just was thrown out due to the tampering, that realistically could have led to some really high-risk people not getting their dose for a longer period of time. And some of them could have caught the virus and some of them could have died. Now, it may have happened or it may not have. I don't actually know whether that happened. I don't know whether we can even say for sure. But people may have or could have died as a result of this. And so 3 years, I don't know. What I do know is these people have to be made an example out of. Now, you can always come in and say, as was argued, this was a person who was not doing well emotionally and mentally and all of the stuff. And clearly those were mitigating factors in terms of the sentencing. But a signal has to be sent that this is just an absolute no. This is, I mean, would we say it's equivalent to tampering with medication? Is it equivalent to doing something to a medication you're dispensing to someone who may be seriously ill and depending on a medication to stay alive? Would it be equivalent to messing with the medication, doing something with it that makes it not work, or dispensing the wrong medication? I mean, it seems that it would be at least at that level, and it was deliberate. It was not an accident. I saw a funny comment online saying, just another victim of cancel culture. He spoke out in some sense against the vaccine by doing this, and now he's been canceled. I hope that those are jokes. These folks have to be made examples out of, and threw away his career, no longer licensed as a pharmacist. Not good times for Mr. Brandenburg, but it has to be taken seriously. My question for you is 3 years the right sentence? Prosecutors asking for 4 years, 3 months, the judge saying 3 years. Do you feel it's too harsh, not harsh enough, or just right? Let me know. You can comment on this story on the David Pakman Show Facebook page, which you can find at facebook.com/David Pakman Show. And don't forget, the second David Pakman Show YouTube channel, which with exclusive clips from the backyard garden, as well as from the David Pakman Show live streams. You can find it at davidpakman.com/Pakman Live. Second YouTube channel, barreling to our first 5,000 subscribers. Quick break, and we will be right back after this. If you value what we do at the David Pakman Show, remember to support us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show, where you can get access to behind-the-scenes videos, the daily bonus show, the commercial-free daily show, as well as special discounts on merch, including hats, hoodies, mugs, and t-shirts. You can support the show for as little as $2 a month. Check it out at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. So Fox News, which of course very loudly and proudly supports the police, as they say, is refusing to run a 1-minute ad, which features police officers condemning the January 6th Trump riots. Consider the absurdity of this. Fox News has run endless opinion programming opposing the movement to reform police and certainly to defund the police. They invite endless guests on to talk about how we must support the police at all costs, and the police are those who should be given leeway all the time, period, because they are protecting our communities, and on and on and on. And we should revere the positions and opinions of police. And here we have Capitol police officers in a video criticizing Republican politicians who have repeatedly attempted to downplay the seriousness of the January 6th Trump riots, and they won't run the ad. Check out the ad so that you know what we're talking about. This is an ad from Midas Touch.
I'm proud of the officers I worked with on January 6th. They fought extremely hard.
Our worst nightmare really come true, an attack on American democracy right here in the nation's capital.
I experienced the most brutal, savage, hand-to-hand combat of my entire life.
I received chemical burns to my face that still have not healed to this day.
I just remember people still swinging metal poles at us, and they were pushing and shoving. They were spraying us with, bear mace and pepper spray.
They were all shouting at us, calling us traitors.
It's been very difficult seeing elected officials and other individuals whitewash the events of that day or downplay what happened.
As an American and as an Army veteran, it's sad to see us attacked by our fellow citizens.
Midas Touch is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Yeah, so Midas Touch, the company that produced the ad, has said that the news outlet called them last Friday to tell them that they weren't going to be airing the ad. Hold on a second, though. Fox was screaming "back the blue" and all of this stuff all of last summer during the George Floyd protests. And then now we have a message from police, and yet they don't want to run it. Don't they support the police? I guess they don't support these officers. Maybe they support like the idea of the police, maybe. And I'll actually get back to that in a second. The details of the ad buy, Ben Meiselas, who's a co-founder of Midas Touch, says they paid over $180,000 to have the ad, over $184,000 to have the ad run from June 6th to 15th, and that Fox News never actually explained to them or gave them a reason why they were not going to be running the ad. And we know Fox News' primary motivation is money. That's what's most important to Fox News. So for them to turn down money for an ad that somebody is paying them to air, you know they are doing it because it would turn their narrative on its head and be completely devastating to them as a channel. Is this a form of cancel culture that they decry? They are canceling the views of these officers, saying we will not allow them on our channel. Can we finally stop saying it was ever really about Blue Lives Matter and about police and defending police officers? It's time that we stop saying that. It was never about that. It's always been about opposing the George Floyd protests. Whenever you bring up the Blue Lives Matter movement in the context of the January 6th riots, which was Trumpists overrunning police, injuring police, they never talk about it in that context. Blue Lives Matter and support the police is only talked about in the context of George Floyd or those types of incidents. But when it's in the context of the January 6th riots, where it was Trumpists overrunning officers, it becomes a non-issue. Then they don't want to hear it. And so what is this really about? What is all of the support the police, support the troops stuff fundamentally about for the right? It's not about police as individuals. That's the distinction you have to understand. Blue Lives Matter is about supporting and defending police as an institution, as a center of power. Same with soldiers and wars. With the support from the Republican Party of the Iraq War in 2003. Think back to that. Support the troops didn't mean support individual soldiers and make decisions that will keep them safe and out of harm's way. If you care about the individual soldier, you don't send them into harm's way to begin with for such a harebrained war meant to retaliate against 9/11, which wasn't even done by Iraq. You don't do that if you care about the individual soldiers. So support the troops meant I basically support Republican President George W. Bush doing whatever the hell he wants as far as troops and the military are concerned. And it is basically more of the same with the police stuff. Support the police might apply to individual officers, maybe. For example, if an officer has been charged in the killing of another unarmed civilian, then it's, support the police means support the individual officers. But now all of a sudden, hey, we've got a group of officers, they have something to say. These were people that were there front and center on January 6th at the Trump riots. They have a message for us. Here's money, Fox, just play the message. Oh, no. Support the police means something very, very different than let these officers get their point across. And there's no question about the legality of what Fox News did. Fox News has every right to accept or turn down any particular advertiser. There's no question whatsoever. But let's not fall for this bogus back the blue, support the police stuff that they claim, because they abandon it like that as soon as it's inconvenient to their narrative. So let's go back a little bit now to this lab leak stuff. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham seems to have said the quiet part out loud last night during an interview on Fox News' Hannity program. Lindsey Graham is a big-time Donald Trump brown-noser, and he was brought on to talk about the so-called lab leak theory of coronavirus, that the virus either originated in or was being studied and then escaped from a lab in Wuhan, China. And Lindsey Graham, in just 9 seconds, really gets to the core of the issue, which is, you know what? If it turned out that Trump was right about the lab leak, which Trump was pushing absolutely without any evidence for months in 2020, it would completely change public perception of Donald Trump's handling of the pandemic overall. Now, it shouldn't, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but it is absolutely true that if Trump happened to be right about the lab leak, it would change people's opinions of Trump. And that's the only thing that's at issue here: Trump's legacy, Trump's reputation, and the optics of it. So let's take a look at the clip. Lindsey Graham saying the quiet part out loud here.
Why does this matter? If Trump was right about the lab leak, it would change the image the public had of President Trump regarding the coronavirus. More importantly,
now Lindsey Graham is simultaneously correct in his prediction, but also completely wrong that it should change our assessment of Donald Trump's handling of the virus. So let's take it piece by piece, because there's really a lot here. First of all, Donald Trump, without evidence for months, suggested and implied and even said that he saw evidence that the coronavirus originated in a Wuhan lab. Now, that has two interpretations. The most literal interpretation is it really originated in the lab. It was a man-made virus, not from the wild, but created in a lab, essentially as a sort of bioweapon. Now, we've already received countless expert analyses on this, which say there's no evidence that this was man-made, period. There's just no evidence of that. The looser interpretation of it came from a Chinese lab would be that while it emerged naturally in the wild, so to speak, it was being studied in the Wuhan Institute of Virology's lab, and because of either an accident or a deliberate act, it ended up in the public. Now, of course, the idea that China would do this to hurt the United States by creating a pandemic to hurt our economy, if that's the idea you subscribe to, I have a bridge to sell you, because this mostly killed people outside of the United States. This was absolutely destructive for China itself, so much so that China has probably been lying about their case and death numbers from the very beginning. But then we get to the really tragic part. If indeed a laboratory in China was involved in the origins of coronavirus, whatever version of these theories you subscribe to, and if Donald Trump actually had a reason to believe that all along, other than, just being provocative or spouting off, it really should do nothing in terms of changing our assessment of Trump's handling of the virus. The lab leak theory has nothing to do with Donald Trump completely failing to ramp up testing in the early phases of the virus. It has nothing to do with Trump downplaying the seriousness of the virus, calling it like the flu and all of this stuff. Trump ignored the risks. Trump continued to hold public events from which people caught and ultimately died of the virus as a result of those events. Trump failed to set up vaccination infrastructure, and when Joe Biden took over, he was starting with essentially nothing. So on the one hand, Lindsey Graham is right. If indeed it came out that some version of the lab leak theory was correct, it would change people's minds, some people's minds, about Trump's handling of the coronavirus, but it would do so in a way that is completely divorced from the fact that Trump failed on every aspect of coronavirus. But they don't care. They are sort of playing for public relations. And that's exactly what Lindsey Graham, knowingly or not, is admitting here. He's admitting it. and he's saying the quiet part out loud. And sadly, it's the truth. And it's really just an indictment of the sad state of critical thinking that we have, because nothing would change about Trump's failed handling if this came from a lab and if Trump knew it or guessed it or happened to stumble across it in some way. Not saying that that's ultimately what we will learn, to be clear, but it should make no difference about our assessment of Trump's handling. If you disagree with me on that, if you think that, no, if Trump was right about lab leak, it would mean he did a good job on the virus. Explain to me how. Okay, go to our website, davidpakman.com, and click on Contact Us. We have a voicemail number, and that number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's an interesting question about the words we use to describe people who do certain things in society, in this case specifically the sort of Q-Trumpist people. Take a listen to this.
Yeah, I'm just wondering why Trump and all of these people that are following him and following Q aren't considered terrorists. If it was foreigners that came with that attitude, would be locking them up, But it's supposed to be terrorism within the country too. As far as who it is, that shouldn't make any difference. Terrorism is terrorism.
Right.
And these guys are terrorizing this country. The Republicans, and not all of them, but those that are following Trump, and ones following QAnon and Trump and his family. That's terrorism. We need to stop those people. I wish they'd just lock them up. It's the best place for them.
Yeah, well, so listen, unless they actually commit a crime, and many of these people have not, or at least not one that we're aware of, you can't just lock people up in that sense. But I think that there's a really good point here, which is if foreigners came to the U.S. and did a bunch of the things that the seditious rioters and Q people and pro-coup people were doing and saying, we would be saying, look at what these people are bringing from outside. They're coming in and they're advocating for the overthrow of the government. I think we would be obviously referring to them as terrorists if that's the case. Instead, when it's what we have, which is, mostly white Trump-supporting men, they're called militia, or they're called patriots, or they're called constitutionalists, or they're referred to as whatever the hell they are referred to. And I think that, to some degree, we don't want to overstate the importance of language. I've, in certain cases, including when it comes to, we've talked about Latinx as a replacement for Latino, or some of these other things. I've pointed out, I think this is a counterproductive focus on the language. But when the language is directly reflective of a political movement's priorities, which is we call certain people militia, and we call certain people lone wolves, and we call certain people terrorists. We call certain people immigrants, but some are just called expats, right? We've talked about these things before. It's not about let's change the language because that will solve the problem necessarily, but let's understand the way in which the language is being used to propagate a false image of what these folks represent in society. And in that sense, I think that the voicemail caller makes a very, very good point. We have a fantastic bonus show for you today. I have to tell you, we will be talking about, I guess, to inspire confidence in I think it's Blue Origin is the name of the company. Jeff Bezos, Amazon founder, is going to be going to space on the first passenger flight for a few minutes. We're going to talk about that on today's bonus show. We will also talk about a US-funded study of whales' hearing that is going to go forward despite concerns for the whales' health. What is going on here and what is being done? Very interesting story, and I've read a bunch of interesting stuff about it. We'll talk about that on today's bonus show. And also, remember that COVID whistleblower from Florida, Rebecca Jones, who was fired after trying to publish the real COVID data to the dashboard of Florida. She is now running against beleaguered Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. And I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there, including some new revelations, actually, about the circumstances of Rebecca Jones' firing. So we're going to talk about all of that on today's bonus show. How do you get access to the bonus show? It really couldn't be easier. Just sign up at joinpakman.com. That's it. You go to joinpakman.com and you get a membership. You can use the coupon code BETTER21 if you would like to get a discount. And if you prefer, if you already have an account with or prefer to access the bonus show via Patreon, you can do that as well by going to patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Either will give you access within mere moments to the bonus show. And also remember, make sure you're subscribed to the new YouTube channel. We have a second YouTube channel now called Pakman Live. People are going crazy. I've seen people threaten to burn down their own homes in a panic over how crazy this new channel is. You can find it at davidpakman.com/Pakman Live. We will see you on today's bonus show or otherwise on tomorrow's program. Thanks a lot for watching today's show. I just want to take a second to tell you about today's sponsors. Ground News is combating divisiveness in media. Ground is a news comparison platform that helps you see multiple perspectives for any news story so you can be more of a well-rounded news reader. Download the free app at ground.news/Pakman.